welcome to my Kitchen Table Money Club, and you're here at my kitchen table, funnily enough. Today's video is for you if you're somebody who, when you're thinking about managing your finances, you've kind of got some goals set up, and you sort of know what you're doing, but you've got an app and you've got this, but nothing's really making any sense. Nothing's really making an awful lot of progress. You can probably classify yourself as being kind of really strong in terms of knowing what you want to be doing, but perhaps weaker in the areas of actually making it happen. And this is really common. So I'm going to be breaking this down into it is a real life story, but it isn't specific to one person, to one client. It's more of a recognised pattern from people I do speak to. And I'm going to call her Rosie, and we're going to bring her to life through a bit of a series of how I worked with Rosie. So there are several things I'm going to take you through. Let me just briefly explain what they are, and then we'll get going through Rosie's story. Okay, so the first thing, a bit of a process I invariably take with most people, is I just kind of gather thoughts and feelings about how he or she arrives, at the start of the session. And there's bound to be a level of vulnerability. And in Rosie's case, she felt incredibly exposed. She actually said she's kind of felt like financially naked. But we'll come on to that in just a few moments. The second thing that we talk about is what her key problems were. And this is really, really important that you're able to identify what they are, because without that, it's quite difficult to move on. So in a foundation session that I offer, which is an hour, if you're familiar with and self-aware enough to know your problems, this can make this particular session really a much more succinct one for you. If you don't know, I've got a three-step process, a three-part process, should I say, called the fairy godmother experience. So if you're not really sure, you're in a muddle, that might be for you. Anyway, so then we went through the third part of the process, which is what has she already tried? I'm very aware that most women in their sort of 40s and plus have certainly have had a level, if not a huge level, in terms of managing their own money. So I'm not going to teach you to suck eggs. I need to know what you already have tried and parts of it what have worked for you, parts of it that haven't worked for you. The fourth thing is, what would happen if things didn't change for Rosie, or she didn't change, her behaviour or her setup didn't change. And we go through some of those consequences, because I think that can really bring it home to you that it is time. And therefore, leading me on then to the next section. So how did Rosie recognise that it really was time for her to make that change? And then number 6, how I guided her. What did we talk about? What did we go through? Number 7, we looked at all the solutions matched to the various problems. And I think I've got sort of 5 or 6 here to share with you that we went through together. And again, I'm talking about Rosie again as a fictional Rosie. She kind of exists, but not explicitly. So then the next thing is how she felt at the end of that session, and any other sort of insights that we gleaned out of that. So stick around if you're interested in Rosie's story. I think you'll recognise her, if not in yourself, then perhaps somebody that you know. Okay, so at the start of Rosie's story, she came to me and she was feeling pretty frustrated and also pretty emotional. Now, most people I speak to, and I totally get this because I feel the emotion too, is you're going to be experiencing a whole range of different feelings. A lot of that is going to be frustration, anger, disappointment, guilt that you've not mastered this already, or perhaps a bit of shame and embarrassment. But most people just feel really bloody muddled, and they just don't quite know what foot to put in front of the other. Specifically with Rosie, she said that she kind of felt this sort of real anxious feeling for quite some time, and it kind of manifested and grown into this quite a fearful thing that she was feeling very exposed. She had no family backup. She was married, and they were earning decent money between them. As a household income, they were doing pretty good on paper, but actually on reflection, how it felt in real life and how it looked in her bank accounts didn't reflect what they were earning. So she was really in a head scratchy sort of position, not quite sure which way to go. So what we then looked at is why that might be. She was really self-aware. She was very aware of her own patterns. She was very aware that she was very strong in theory, as much that she had a really good, decent level of financial literacy, to put it bluntly. She kind of knew a lot about what she ought to know about, which is great. But what she wasn't particularly good is applying it. Ain't that the truth for many of us? How many times have you bought yourself a healthy eating cookbook and then you It just sits on the shelf gathering dust, looking at all mine up there just now. Anyway, so that's a little bit about Rosie's background. So what were her key problems? Let's list those out. She had credit card debts. When I say she, they had credit card debts. And yes, I was working specifically with her in this example, mostly because I don't work with couples per se. I can and I have, but one-on-one tends to be more of a succinct conversation, and it doesn't end up in marriage counselling. Yeah, we'll do that one another time. But yeah, credit card debt across a multiple assortment of credit cards. And what happened is, one thing leads to another, and invariably what was happening now is that she was using credit, or they were using credit, just day to day. Oh, bung that on the credit card, we're going to go shopping. How much is in the account? 50 quid. Oh, we'll put it on the credit card. And it just became a complete habit. Now, the problem with that is, of course, is that it's being used for convenience rather than for a strategic, intentional use. Now, I have no problem with credit cards whatsoever, and I'll come on to what we talked about when it comes to the solutions angle. But of course, what happens in her situation was the interest was, building and building and building over time. So every single thing she was purchasing, from the weekly food shop to a holiday, it was costing 20, 25, 30% more than it ought to have done, because of the sheer volume of time it was taking them to pay down that balance, which didn't seem to really ever move down very much. Her second problem is that they had no emergency fund. You want to call this a resilient savings account, whatever you want to call it. It left a real glaring gap that's really the heart of the exposure that vulnerability came from. If something happened in the home to one of the cars, whatever it might be, and they needed to get their hands on several hundred quid, the only place they were going to get that from was the credit card again. The third problem, they really felt like, and this is really common with a lot of people I work with, and I felt it too myself, so I know it. When you're living kind of month to month, you feel like you're living hand to mouth, and that there doesn't seem to be enough to go around, and yet there should be. There's a nagging sense that there's something missing in her process. What was she doing wrong? She was taking the blame for that. So the next thing was that sporadic and inconsistent tracking of her expenses. So she kind of did it for a while and then forgot about it, got fed up with doing it. And I have to agree, it's not necessarily the most fun thing you're ever going to do in any given day. But of course, what it does mean is that when you're tracking it, you know where it's going. If you're not tracking it, it slips through, doesn't it? It like water through our fingers, it's just gone. I think when it comes to the actual data gathering process, she was finding it incredibly demotivating, because it was not only just time consuming, but also because she had some financial goals, which I'll come on to shortly. Nothing was really tying up and making any sense of things that she could actually apply to her day-to-day life. The next problem that she was facing is that she had no travel fund. Now, they have a daughter, and they also love to go not just on holidays abroad, but also to investigate parts of the UK, have a couple of weekends away as a couple. Those lovely things that we should be able to afford. But, the cost of living crisis has probably put the kibosh on it for most of us. But what was important to them, and for the relationship with their daughter, is that they do get to take her away every now and again. And again, that just went on the credit card. And then the last particular problem we discussed was there was a real gap between what she had as goals, which I just mentioned, and they weren't actually really clearly defined, so kudos to her for that. But there was no real practical system that married up with her goals that made any real sense, hence the feeling and the reality of not really making any progress towards them. Okay, so the third part, what had she already tried? So she actually had got 5 goals really clearly laid out with time frames, which is absolutely brilliant, because most of us don't, to be fair, or maybe there's one thing, but she actually had 5, and I'll share them with you. Her first goal was to pay off her debt in the next 2 to 3 years. The second one was a travel fund, and she wanted to set that up ASAP. The third one is she wanted stronger savings, not least an emergency fund, but also savings to gather momentum and see her through the next several years. The fourth one was to eventually look at property investment. They wanted to not just have their own home, which they did, they have a mortgage, but they wanted to actually buy another property that they wanted to rent out. That was a real dream of theirs. And the fifth one is that she wanted a more controlled day-to-day budget without it feeling like a real bloody hairdo, you know. She wanted to feel joyful and actually a pleasure to manage it, rather than it feeling like that awful grind that you just reluctantly get yourself at the kitchen table to do. She mentally assigned herself with various time frames and all of these, as I said, and she and her husband had opened up ISA accounts, savings accounts for each person. She had a lifetime ISA and her husband had a stocks and shares ISA. So as I say, they were making some small but consistent contributions to these ISAs, but nothing was ever really feeling like it was coming together. So then the next thing is we discussed what would happen if things didn't change for her. And the consequences of inaction to her were really, really crystal clear. She said she had a good income and clear goals, but of course she realised that actually without any particular system, nothing was translating them into action. And then without that action, her credit cards or their credit cards would continue to mount up, or at least stay around that sort of 3.5k limit. They had a limit. They were able to get up to sort of 7,000 on their credit card, but actually didn't want to get anywhere near that. They were already over halfway most of the time, and they were fed up with living in that credit cycle. So that was really important to them from a safety point of view, but also from something's got to give in life. They were sort of edging towards 40, sort of in the mid to late 30s, and they're thinking, well, we don't really want to still have this emotional noose around our neck of a credit card when we do reach the age of 40, when we're looking at starting to expand on a property portfolio. That's not going to be any good to us. We've got to get that gone. So the second thing that she felt very strongly about, that if nothing changed, one of the big consequences would be that she would be invariably watching years and years of their joint hard work, feeling like it was just circling the drain and just not really going anywhere. And she was feeling that sort of heat of pressure, like you do when you get to a certain age or a certain season of life. You do, don't you? You kind of get to that, something's just got to give. I need to be a different person now. I'm not 20 years old anymore, I'm not 25 anymore. I want different things. And that's, of course you do, of course we do, that's just life. So of course, by the consequences of her still running their household finances like she did 10 years ago, that would be really the life they would be setting themselves up for. So that was a massive consequence to them. What she did actually say to me was, I've been earning my own money for 20 years. My mum didn't tell me much about how to manage money, not entirely sure she was that confident either. So I've kind of bumbled along as well. And what's really important is that I actually feel a bit scared, and I don't want to pass that down to my 10-year-old daughter, that feeling of scarcity or being fearful against money, because I want her to grow up to be a real independent woman if she wants to be, and she should be able to look after herself. So that intergenerational kind of aspect of managing her money properly now was a huge pull for her. So the next thing that I asked about was how does she recognise the need to change? What made her reach out and book a session? And she was really clear on that. She said she'd reached a point in January, like you all do when you look at your goals for the year or look at last year, have a bit of a reflection. She said, I just suddenly felt quite cold with fear that my life wasn't moving on, or our joint life wasn't moving on, and this year would pan out much the same as last year and the previous year and the previous year. And she said, I just really knew we had to make a change or we'd be stuck in that loop forever. I don't want to be stuck anymore. She wanted to have that feeling of freedom. And we talk about financial freedom a lot. I don't know that everybody wants a financial freedom in the truest sense of the word, but actually freedom itself from the tie to earning money and it being literally a hand-to-mouth kind of a situation. People want that gone. So when we looked at the next stage, which is how I guided her, I immediately reframed Rosie's own self-criticism. And my God, do we all do this? We are all our own worst enemy, aren't we, with whatever it is. And she was just the same. Once I'd listened to her story, I reflected back that actually she was really good with money. She actually had a very positive and healthy relationship with money, and a genuine respect for it. And that was really clear in our conversation. And she was really bowled over by it. And I think when you're talking about things, sometimes you're stuck in your own language, aren't you? Your own beliefs. And maybe you don't realise you've changed in the last few years. So what I provide is the ability to be that mirror and mirror back to her what she's told me and what I took from the conversation. And she was genuinely really surprised. And I don't do it for flattery. I do it because it's a genuine recognition that actually you're way ahead of the curve than you think you are. But there are some things, of course, that need to be tightened up, tidied up, or put into a process so that you feel like it's on a solid ground. So one thing that, you know, the reframe that was really apparent for Rosie, and I can see it, you know, when I'm with someone, you can see someone go, oh, you know, it was that feeling that she absolutely had already shifted out of that early 20s, mid 20s character of running her household into a fresh sense of agency, taking ownership of what she owned, or taking ownership of what she was earning and her outgoings, and making something a bit more meaningful out of it for the season of life that she was in. So there were 6 things that we looked at specifically that would be a really good sort of solution to each of her segmented problems that she felt. So I'll run them through with you now what they were, and then we'll go into a little tiny bit of detail for each one after that, just to give you a bit of a flavour. So the first thing was, you know, a visual sort of timeline. The next thing we looked at was having a 3-pot system. Then we looked at using her 13th month bonus more strategically. The next thing was stop using credit cards for living day to day. Emergency fund as an immediate priority. Children's financial education, and how that kind of wrapped up into more of a solid approach. So first thing, I love this because I'll take a photo and insert it in here. I love a post-it note and I love my big wall calendar. And for me, when I can see things regularly, then it helps me to stay focused on the thing. Now, people love to put things on their fridges, you know, whatever it is that works for you. This can be really, really handy. So what we talked about is starting with some sort of larger scale visual for her, and it might just be a couple of A4 bits of paper stuck together on the wall somewhere, she could then put her goals on it in her timeline. So from the month we were in, maybe every quarter, she could map it out right the way through to the next sort of 5 years, and just put in it a timeline of things that she wanted to achieve and when and why, most importantly. It gives your brain something to work towards. It's quite difficult to see yourself in the future, and we're hardwired not to, actually. Literally, it's a day-to-day kind of situation, but also I think, you know, we can mostly say that, you know, oh, this time next year, Rodney, but not necessarily, oh, this time in 5 years' time. It's more of an abstract thing. So having that visual element was really helpful. And we talked about ways that she might like to use her calendar as well when it comes to their income, because they both have their income that come in on different times of the month. Of course, bills go out and it becomes a real sort of messy situation, but again, I'll cover that on another video. I can actually show you how that might work and look for you. If you're interested, stick a yes please in the comments. Okay, so second thing, the 3-pot system. Specifically living hand to mouth, no structure for savings or spending. I recommended organising household finances into sort of really three really clear streams. And I talk about this all the time, but let me walk them through with you again. The one is the essentials, the things you cannot live without. The second one is savings. You get to that first, and then you spend what's left, because of course if you do it the other way around, there's never anything left over, is there? So put your savings first. You might have heard that term called paying yourself first, whatever you want to call it. Basically, look at the pot that you've got left over after the essentials have come out, and it looks bigger, of course it's bigger. Then say, do you know what, let's portion that amount into emergency, that amount into our holiday fund, and then whatever's left over is what you've got to spend. So the third thing we talked about, using that 13th month bonus strategically. Now she's in a really fortunate situation, and most of us don't tend to get bonuses these days, unless you're in a kind of a sales job, I guess, or loads of other circumstances. But anyway, she was getting an annual bonus, but what was happening is it just kind of frittered away, disappeared without any sort of real intentional process for it. So we, excuse me, had a look at using it specifically, because it was about the same kind of money every single year, and it was decent money, you know, we're talking a couple of £1,000. So that would be used actually to fund her travel fund. And if she only used that for her travel fund, that then became something almost obsolete when she was thinking about it every month and not worrying about it, but it was frustrating her every single month and she had nothing left in the travel pot. So that alone was her travel fund, and that was just like, ping, that makes sense. The next thing we talked about was stopping using credit cards for living. Now, okay, this specifically to this situation, this does make sense. It might not make sense to you. You might be using credit cards completely strategically for a personal cash flow. You might be getting air miles out of it that you use, and it works for you. Fine, you're paying them off every single month, or pretty much every single month, so you're not accumulating interest that's costing you a blooming fortune. Crack on. But in her particular situation, we found that changing this mindset was probably going to be the biggest thing of all. So going back to the 3-pot situation, when she could see exactly how much they had to spend, then of course came the slightly more detailed budgeting when it came to what that looked like for what they wanted to spend. And her biggest fear actually at this point was, this is going to be massive. And I said, yeah, it could well be. So why don't we talk about how we can break that down? Which we did. So ultimately, for her, this was going to be probably the biggest shift of all of them, and it isn't something you can do overnight. It isn't something you can just pack up on a Sunday and start on a Monday. This is going to be quite a different way of doing things, so this is going to take some planning, and of course that's what I can help you with as well. Then we talked about the emergency funds as the priority and what she felt ought to be like many thousands, when we talked about the fact, well, why don't you just start with £500? You know, can you put £100 away this month maybe? Yeah, I can actually. Right, let's set it up. And if you're tempted to dip into such an emergency account, then maybe you ought to have that in a different bank. Still clearly easily accessible, that's the whole point of it. But so it isn't kind of flashing up on the same account or on the same banking system that you're currently using, so that it's kind of out of sight, out of mind, which was really useful for her. Building up incrementally, of course, you know, then you get to your 1,000, then you get to 1,500. So whatever sort of increments, £500 increments probably feels quite comfortable. It did for her. So that might be a really good way to get that motivation to build that little nest egg up. And then children's financial education. So she felt like she couldn't really talk to her daughter much about money because she didn't really have the language. And actually, most children, obviously through different stages, have a different awareness and appreciation of money. So we spoke about some of the books that she might like to read. And if you're interested in those, do let me know, and I can put a few recommendations in the comments. But one of my colleagues has actually got what's called Grandpa's Fortune Fables. I should have got it here to show you. Again, I'll try and edit it in to show you. That's a fantastic book. I really enjoyed reading it actually. But of course, every age group might need a different approach, so be aware of that. So how does she feel at the end of all of that? Now, it was a marked lightening, relief with Rosie at the end of the session. She said that the conversation had really helped her to see that she actually really was already on the right track, and she wasn't really doing wrong things. It's just that the self-blame that she'd come into the session with in the first place was misplaced actually. She didn't need that. What she needed was a more steady physical approach, a practical application approach to what she had already tried to do previously. She finished with a real sort of, it was very sweet actually. She had a really lovely way. She said, I just needed to meet you. I felt a bit like I was going to well up actually. And it does get emotional when I have conversations with people. And it can be as simple as that. Just talking it out with somebody and just hearing someone else who has got quite a lot of experience, not as I do, and being able just to go, have you tried this? Why have you thought about that? What about this? This has always worked for me. And you know what? It can just make a really massive difference. So, you know, additional insights for me, and by the way, I'm kind of looking at my iPad here because I actually wrote a blog and a Substack piece on exactly this, but I'm very aware that sometimes it's nice to hear it, isn't it, from the horse's mouth, and calling myself a horse. But additional insights for me. Rosie's story really reflects the powerful difference really between having financial intelligence and financial systems, because sometimes we can be in the messy middle and have a bit of some and a bit of the other, but not much of enough. No, it doesn't make sense. Not enough of each, or maybe you're more skewed towards one than the other. So financial paralysis is a term I like to use, and it's what happens when a perfectly capable, intelligent person has just got so much information. They're reading blogs, they're listening to podcasts, they're reading the Financial Times, articles, but it's overwhelming, and you don't really know how to apply that to your own situation. And that's where I come in. So if you would love to work through your story with me, that's what I'm here for. I'll put the details in the description so you can see. I've got a whole page on my website dedicated to what mentoring looks like with me. And actually I'm going to be doing another piece very soon, both video and blog, on the difference between kind of mentoring, coaching, training, and how it invariably gets used intermingling? How it intermingles to create a really effective conversation, with me. So I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you got something out of it. And if you want to read that again, because sometimes reading it on top of hearing it can be really helpful, I'll direct you to the blog and also to Substack. Just a little PS, if you don't mind my asking, I would love your feedback, because over on Substack, I have created the Kitchen Table Money Club, and I'm considering taking a paid tier level, whereby this really does become a club, for us to gather together. And what that would look like, I'm not entirely sure yet, so I would love your input on that. The thoughts I've had so far would be that every month I would do perhaps a live tutorial with you, answer the questions that you've got in the moment. Maybe I could bring in some experts, maybe I can bring in a mortgage expert to help you with your questions, maybe a tax expert, a pension expert, whatever it might be. Bring these people into our world ad hoc, maybe, or do a whole calendar of events so you can see what's going on ahead of time. Maybe give you discount on my one-to-one sessions, maybe give you free access to all my e-guides and workbooks and templates and spreadsheets and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's just a framework in my mind at the moment, but I'm thinking that it might be quite a nice thing to create. So let me know if that's of interest to you. If you've got enough interest, then I'll make it happen. All right, thanks for watching. See you again soon.